By the third week of November, every field along Route 879 had gone brown. Every field except one. On a steep hillside outside Curwensville, Pennsylvania, thousands of bare gray shrubs were covered in narrow yellow flowers. They looked like sparks caught in the branches. Cars slowed down. Then trucks started stopping. A nursery buyer from Ohio walked the rows with orange flagging tape. A soil scientist pushed metal probes into the slope, and two technicians from a botanical processor spent 4 hours clipping leaves, twigs, and bark, then sealing the samples in numbered bags. 6 years earlier, that hillside could not hold a hard rain. Now companies were arguing over what it could produce. The woman who planted it, 49-year-old Evelyn Hale, gave almost nobody a straight answer. When neighbors asked what the yellow flowers were worth, she would glance down at the ground and say, "The flowers are only what you can see." That answer irritated people. It also kept them watching. Why would a natural products company care about an exhausted dairy farm in central Pennsylvania? Why would Evelyn spend years planting a crop that bloomed after everything else had shut down? And what had she understood about that hillside that everyone else had missed? There had never been anything mysterious about the Hale farm. It was simply running out of room to fail. Evelyn grew up there with an older sister, a younger brother, 36 milk cows, and a father who believed land only became a problem when a person stopped working hard enough. For most of her childhood, the farm survived on milk checks, hay, and silage corn. The margins were thin, but the routine was familiar. Plant, cut, feed, milk, borrow when machinery broke, catch up when the milk price improved, then do it again. But the ground was changing. Heavy wagons crossed the same lanes every season. The lower field stayed compacted and wet. The upper slope lost moisture so quickly in July that the corn leaves curled before noon, and every spring, muddy water ran down toward the county road. Evelyn noticed the color first. The runoff was not rainwater anymore. It was the farm leaving. Her father saw it too, but he called it weather. He repaired washouts with the loader, planted the same slope again, and treated every lost strip of soil like a temporary inconvenience. By the time Evelyn left for college, the farm was leasing another 30 acres just to grow enough feed. By the time she was 35, her father had sold the dairy herd and rented the fields to a neighboring operator. The rent covered taxes. It did not cover the damage. After her father died, Evelyn's sister wanted to sell the property as one piece. Her brother wanted to divide it into building lots. Both plans made sense. The barn roof leaked. The milk house had not been used in years. The tractor needed a block heater, a battery, and a person willing to forgive it. And the eastern hill was worth more to a developer than it was to anyone planting corn. 2 days before the realtor was scheduled to photograph the property, Evelyn walked to the top of that hill. The ground was hard enough to ring under her boot. Below her, a narrow brown scar cut through the field where the last storm had carried soil into the ditch. She crouched and pressed her fingers into it. The top layer was dry powder. 2 inches down, the soil was packed like brick. That was when she realized the farm was not poor. It was overdrawn. For decades, every harvest had taken something out. Almost nothing had been deposited back. She called her sister and brother from the hill. "I want the farm as my share," she said. Her sister thought grief was making the decision. Her brother thought guilt was. Neither was completely wrong. But Evelyn had another reason. For 18 years, she had worked in quality control and purchasing for a company that supplied ingredients to soap makers, herbal brands, and small cosmetic manufacturers. She knew what happened behind the labels. She knew which growers were rejected because they could not document a batch. She knew which crops looked profitable until drying, testing, storage, and freight were added. And she knew a small farm rarely survived by producing the same commodity as someone with 10 times the acreage and newer equipment. Evelyn did not need a better way to grow corn. She needed a crop that belonged on difficult ground, a crop with more than one buyer, a crop that could stay rooted for years, and a crop whose value did not depend on stripping the field bare every spring. For 7 months, she researched perennial botanical plants. Most failed quickly. Some required hand labor she could never afford. Some needed processing equipment that cost more than the farm. Some had enthusiastic online markets and no dependable commercial buyers. Then she found a native shrub most people in the county had seen without ever noticing. American witch hazel. It grew along woodland edges and shaded ravines. Its bark, leaves, and young twigs were used in botanical extracts. Nurseries sold it as a native landscape plant, and in late autumn, after the leaves had dropped, it opened yellow flowers on bare branches. The plant was slow, the market was exacting, and none of it promised fast money. That was exactly why Evelyn kept reading. Witch hazel would not repair the farm by itself. No crop could. But it could become the permanent frame for a different system. The roots could remain in place. The alleys could stay covered. Pruned material could enter a traceable botanical market. Young plants could go to nurseries. Leaf litter could return to the soil, and the steepest ground would no longer be opened and replanted every year. Evelyn was not looking for a miracle. She was looking for a business model that did not spend soil to make income. The following April, a flatbed truck delivered 2,400 bare-root witch hazel plants. Dale Rourke saw it arrive from the field across the road. Dale farmed nearly 700 acres of corn, soybeans, and hay. He was efficient, respected, and deeply suspicious of any field that did not look clean from a moving truck. He watched the driver unload bundles for 10 minutes before crossing the road. "What are those?" "Witch hazel." Dale stared at the bundles. "That stuff in the woods, the same species. You paid for it." Evelyn lifted one bundle onto a pallet. "That is usually how deliveries work." Dale ignored the joke. "How long before it pays? I don't know." He blinked. "You ordered 2,400 plants and you don't know." "I know when it can produce. I don't know when the business will work." Dale looked up the empty hill. "So this is an experiment?" "No," Evelyn said. "An experiment is cheaper." Within a week, half the county had an opinion. Some thought she was building a Christmas tree farm. Some thought she had joined a government conservation program. One man at the feed store said she was growing perfume bushes for city people. Evelyn let them talk. She had 41 acres of harder questions. The steepest section shed water too fast. The lower bench held it too long. So before most of the shrubs went into the ground, she rebuilt the way water moved across the farm. She hired a contractor with a low disturbance ripper to open compacted strips without turning the whole hill upside down. She laid out rows along the contour instead of straight downhill. She spread compost only where soil tests showed the worst carbon loss. Between rows, she seeded orchard grass, clover, and deep-rooted native forbs. She mulched each plant with aged wood chips. She left wider flowering strips near the field edges, and she stopped mowing every green thing to the same height. From the road, the farm looked untidy. Up close, it looked intentional. Dale disagreed. "You're going to lose those plants in weeds," he told her. Evelyn pulled a fistful of clover apart and showed him the damp soil beneath it. "I'm trying to stop losing the hill." For 2 years, the witch hazel did almost nothing impressive. It survived. It added a few inches. It produced small leaves and thin stems, that was all. The bills, however, grew quickly. Deer fencing, irrigation line, compost, a used flail mower, repairs to the barn, replacement plants for the rows that failed in shallow soil. Evelyn kept her purchasing job 3 days a week from a desk in the old milk house. She sold vegetable starts in spring. She propagated a few hundred witch hazel seedlings and cuttings for future nursery stock, and every month, she updated a spreadsheet that remained stubbornly red. Her sister called carefully. "Are you sure you want to keep doing this?" Evelyn looked through the milkhouse window at rows of plants barely tall enough to reach her knee. "No," she said. Her sister went quiet. Then Evelyn added, "I'm sure the land is improving. I'm still waiting to find out whether the market deserves it." By the third year, the first visible changes appeared. Water no longer cut one straight path to the road. The grassed alleys slowed it. The contour rows broke its speed. In test areas, the soil surface stayed darker after dry weeks. Roots from the cover plants opened channels through the compacted layer. Earthworms returned beneath the mulch, and when Evelyn pushed a spade into ground that had once resisted like concrete, it went in without her standing on it. The witch hazel was growing too. Not quickly, but steadily. The stems thickened. The root crowns expanded. Each fall, more leaves dropped beneath the rows and stayed there. No single plant was restoring the farm. The change came from the whole system. Permanent woody roots, living cover, less disturbance, compost used where it mattered, organic material left on the surface, water given time to enter instead of being hurried downhill. That summer, the first serious buyer visited. Her name was Lillian Park, and she sourced regional plant material for a small botanical distillery in western New York. Lillian did not begin by admiring the flowers. She asked about spray records, harvest windows, drying temperature, foreign material, moisture targets, lot codes, traceability, storage, humidity. Evelyn had answers for most of it. For everything else, she opened a notebook. At the end of the visit, Lillian clipped a young twig, bent it between her fingers, and looked down the rows. "You may be able to supply us in 2 seasons," she said. Evelyn did not smile. "How much?" "For a first trial. Maybe 800 pounds dried, depending on the assay." That number was not life-changing, but it was the first number attached to a real buyer. Evelyn spent the next 6 months preparing. She cleaned one side of the barn, built screen drying racks, installed fans, bought a moisture meter, created batch sheets, marked harvest zones, and took out a small equipment loan she could only justify if the trial happened. Then, in February, Lillian's company was purchased by a larger processor. 3 weeks later, the regional sourcing program was canceled. The email was 6 sentences long. It erased 2 years of planning. Evelyn called every contact she had. Most companies already had suppliers. 2 wanted volumes she could not produce. 1 wanted a price below her harvest cost. The nursery orders were not ready to carry the farm, and the equipment payment was due in May. Her brother drove in with a solution. A storage developer had offered cash for 12 roadside acres, not the whole farm, just the flat entrance and lower bench. The sale would clear the equipment loan, repair the barn roof, and give Evelyn breathing room. It would also cut across the best access to the hill. For 3 nights, she left the contract on the kitchen table. On the 4th morning, survey stakes appeared along the road. Dale stopped his truck beside one of them. "You selling?" "Maybe." He looked toward the witch hazel rows. "I thought this was the long plan." "So did I." The words came out sharper than she intended. Dale rested one arm on the window. "You want me to tell you I was wrong?" "No." "You want me to tell you to keep going?" "No." "What do you want?" Evelyn looked at the red survey ribbon snapping in the wind. "I want the ground to be worth more alive than it is divided." Dale had no answer for that. Neither did the bank. 2 weeks later, the remnants of a tropical storm crossed Pennsylvania. Rain began before dark and intensified through the night. By midnight, water covered sections of the county road. Culverts backed up. A bare soybean field upstream lost long ribbons of soil. Evelyn did not sleep. At 3:40 in the morning, she pulled on boots, took a flashlight, and walked to the eastern hill. Water was moving through the farm, but it was not charging downhill. It spread through the grassed alleys. It bent the clover flat. It gathered briefly behind mulch ridges, then slipped sideways along the contour. The witch hazel roots were still young, but they held the planting strips together. A few channels opened near the lower crossing. One drain failed. Several rows flooded at the ends. The system was not perfect, but the hill remained on the hill. At daylight, Dale arrived with mud up the side of his truck. Part of his lower field had washed into the ditch. He walked halfway up Evelyn's slope without speaking. Then he knelt and pushed his fingers into the saturated ground. "How bad?" "2 breaks near the crossing," Evelyn said. Some mulch moved. Dale looked downhill at water running almost clear through the last grass. "That all?" "That's what I can see." He stood and stared across the rows. The cover did this. The cover helped. And the shrubs. The roots helped. He waited. Evelyn wiped rain from her face. "It's all of it, Dale." "That's the point." For once, he did not argue. The storm proved the land system. It did not solve the business. The contract was still on Evelyn's kitchen table. The loan was still due. And a farm cannot make a payment with cleaner runoff. But the storm changed who was paying attention. A county conservation specialist photographed the slope. A university extension team asked to compare infiltration rates inside and outside the planted alleys. One of those photos reached a native plant grower near Pittsburgh. The grower called Evelyn about 300 young plants for a restoration project. Then he gave her the name of another botanical buyer. Marcus Vale managed raw material sourcing for a family-owned distiller in Maryland. He visited in September. Like Lillian, he cared less about the flowers than the records. He inspected the drying room, checked her harvest map, asked how she separated leaf material from young twig material, asked whether she could hold moisture below the company threshold. Then he walked to the rows damaged by the storm. "What happened here?" "Water found the weak point. You fixed it. I changed the crossing." Fixing it would mean pretending it can't happen again. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled. "That is the first useful answer I've heard from a grower all month." His company did not offer a rescue. It offered a trial. 600 pounds of dried leaf and fine twig material. 3 lots. Separate harvest dates. Full records, payment after testing. It was smaller than Lillian's canceled order. It was also real. Evelyn declined the developer's contract. She sold an unused hay rake, extended the equipment loan by 6 months, and spent the fall preparing for a harvest that could still be rejected. The first serious harvest began the following August. Evelyn brought in 3 seasonal helpers and trained each one before anyone entered a row. No diseased material. No heavy stems, no wet harvest, no unlabeled bins. Each load came to the barn, was weighed, checked, spread thinly, and assigned a lot number. Fans ran through the afternoon. At night, Evelyn rotated trays and recorded moisture. The barn smelled sharp, green, and slightly medicinal. For 9 days, she slept in 3-hour pieces. When the first shipment was ready, Marcus returned with a sampling kit. He opened containers from all 3 lots, checked color, checked cut size, compared weights to the batch sheets. Then he sealed the samples for the lab. The truck left without a payment. Evelyn watched it turn onto the county road and felt less relieved than she expected. The farm had produced a crop. The market still had to accept it. 12 days later, an email arrived. All 3 lots passed. The payment did not erase 6 years of work. It did not repay every repair, every dead plant, or every hour spent rebuilding the slope. But it covered the seasonal harvest cost, the equipment extension, and enough principal to keep the farm intact. That same month, the Pittsburgh grower increased the nursery order from 300 plants to 500. A landscape contractor reserved another 200 for spring. For the first time, The farm had 3 different ways to earn: botanical material, nursery stock, and contract propagation for restoration plantings. None was large enough to carry the farm alone. Together, they changed the arithmetic. By the 6th year, the Hale farm looked nothing like the property Evelyn had inherited. The barn roof was tight. The old milk house held records, moisture meters, and shipping labels. The eastern hills stayed covered through winter. Test plots that had begun below 2% organic matter were approaching 3% near the most established rows. After moderate rain, water entered the soil faster and left the farm slower. The lower bench still needed drainage work. The shallow ridge still lost plants in dry years. There was no miracle. There was only measurable improvement. And every November, when the rest of the county turned gray, the witch hazel opened thousands of yellow flowers across bare branches. People pulled over to photograph them. Buyers came for samples. Nursery customers walked the rows. Dale came for a different reason. He parked near the barn one afternoon and looked across the hill. "I've got 28 acres behind the creek," he said. "Too wet for corn half the time. Too expensive to keep forcing it." Evelyn leaned against the gate. "You asking about witch hazel? I'm asking how you decide what the ground should be doing. That's a better question." They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table. Evelyn showed him soil tests, labor costs, rejected cuttings, freight charges, and the years when the numbers did not work. She told him not to copy her crop without finding a buyer first. She told him permanent planting did not mean maintenance-free. She told him the field had to fit the market, but the market also had to fit the field. Dale studied the records. So the shrubs saved the farm. Evelyn shook her head. No, changing the withdrawals saved it. He looked up. She pointed to the old soil reports. For years, this place paid every bill by spending something it could not replace quickly: topsoil, structure, water-holding capacity. We called the crop income and ignored the debt underneath it. Dale sat back. And now a harvest can leave the system standing. Evelyn's sister and brother visited during bloom that year. Her brother stood at the top of the eastern hill where the first erosion scar had once cut through the field. The scar was gone. In its place were contour rows, winter cover, and yellow flowers suspended over dark ground. "I thought you kept it because of Dad," he said. "I did. That wasn't enough to make it work. No." He looked toward the barn where workers were loading nursery stock for a spring restoration project. What was? Evelyn considered the question. "Dad taught us how to keep a farm working," she said. "I had to learn how to stop making the land pay for everything." Over 6 years, the Hale farm never became a giant operation. It did something more useful. It became difficult to kill with one bad price. A weak botanical season could be softened by nursery orders. A slow nursery year could be carried by contract propagation. The ground remained protected while the business adjusted. The trees and shrubs kept growing between invoices. The roots kept working when no truck was in the lane. The farm was no longer betting its entire future on one annual harvest from the same tired slope. People still came for the flowers. They were unusual enough to stop traffic, bright yellow ribbons opening on bare wood after the first hard frosts. But Evelyn had been right from the beginning. The flowers were only what people could see. The real change was under their boots. It was in the water that stayed long enough to soak in, the soil that no longer reached the ditch first, the roots that remained after harvest, the income that came from 3 smaller doors instead of one desperate gate, and the simple fact that the farm could produce without being dismantled each season to do it. For 40 years, the Hale farm had treated topsoil like money that would never run out. Evelyn did not save it by finding a magical plant. She saved it by changing the accounting. The farm became valuable again, when every harvest stopped being a withdrawal from the ground.